and Director of Ontario Works for the City of Hamilton. Welcome to our speaker series webinar, a look at Maytree's annual Welfare in Canada report. Please note that we will record this webinar and OMSSA will release it after the report has been published. I'll begin today's webinar with land acknowledgement. The land on which OMSSA operates is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Ojibwe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I'm joining the webinar today from Hamilton. This is located on Treaty 3 territory, the Between the Lakes Treaty of 1792 between the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Crown. OMSSA appreciates and acknowledges that many people participating in our webinar are based in our communities across what has been deemed the province of Ontario, which is covered by 46 treaties and agreements. OMSSA is mindful of broken covenants and failures, and we must acknowledge that statements like these do not mean anything if we do not back them up with action. Our goal as an association is to develop and enhance strong partnerships with Indigenous organizations, especially as we increase opportunities for members to build their understanding and relationships with Indigenous communities across Ontario. I invite you to reflect on this land acknowledgement, what it means to you, and how you are upholding the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action. Each one of our member organizations has an important contribution to make to help achieve the calls for action. Miigwech, thank you. For those of you who may be unaware, Maytree has been dedicated to creating solutions to poverty with their many partners since it was founded in 1982. They believe that everyone has the right to a life without poverty. Our economic and social systems create poverty when they fail to focus on human dignity. The most enduring way to keep people out of poverty is to reimagine and rebuild public systems of support to respect, protect, and fulfill the economic and social rights of every person in Canada. Maytree uses a human rights-based approach to poverty that puts people first. It begins from the premise that everyone is equal in rights and dignity, with their fundamental human right to an adequate standard of living. In their work to eliminate poverty, they examine the systems that create poverty and advance solutions for strengthening those systems. They call on every level of government to live up to their duty to respect, protect, and fulfill our human rights. They measure success by the impact that systems-level decisions have on people's daily lives. The annual Welfare in Canada report enumerates and examines the total welfare incomes of example households receiving social assistance in a given year and details some key features of social assistance programs in all 13 provincial and territorial jurisdictions in Canada. As the only publicly available resource that compiles and analyzes this data, the Welfare in Canada report is the primary source for evaluating Canada's progress on fulfilling the human rights to an adequate standard of living for households receiving social assistance. Please note, the Welfare in Canada report is expected to be released at the end of July. This webinar offers a sneak peek and a preview to the upcoming report. While Maytree has released several reports in the income and employment sector, and to manage your expectations for today, this webinar is specifically going to focus on providing a preview of the upcoming Welfare in Canada report and not reflect on other areas that may be of interest to our members, like employment services transformation in Ontario. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenters for this afternoon. Jennifer Laidley is a Maytree Fellow and has focused on poverty and income security related advocacy and research for more than 20 years. By supporting and learning from people who are living in poverty, by speaking to government officials and legislative committees, writing and publishing policy papers, advocacy reports, as well as other public education materials. As a researcher and lead author of Maytree's annual Welfare in Canada report since 2020, Jennifer has contributed her deep knowledge on social assistance systems and expertise in research, data analysis, and policy advocacy to this unique and important publication. Welcome, Jennifer. Mohi Tabera is a senior policy advisor at Maytree and leads Maytree's income security policy file. His work uses a human rights lens to focus on reducing the rate and depth of poverty and transforming Canada's social safety net. He co-authors the Welfare in Canada report and authors the Social Assistance Summaries report. Before joining Maytree, Mohi was a researcher at the Institute for Research on Public Policy, where he worked on several policy issues, including income security, criminal justice reform, and institution building. Mohi holds a master's degree in political science from the University of Toronto and an honors bachelor's degree in political science from McGill. At the end of their presentation, I'll moderate a Q&A session using the Q&A feature in our Zoom webinar chat. Until the presentation concludes, we will disable the chat. Please take note of the questions and comments that you have for our presenters during the presentation, and once the Q&A begins, we'll enable the chat and the Q&A function, and you can send them in to us. I'll now turn it over to our presenters to get us started. Jennifer and Mohi, over to you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Stuart. Let me just share my screen here, and we can start with the slide deck that we've got. There we go.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today, and thank you for OMSSA for organizing this. As Stuart mentioned, my name is Mohideen Tabara, and I'm a senior policy researcher at Maytree. I'm coming to you today from Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, on the traditional territories of the Kanien'kehá:ka of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among many First Nations.
And I'm Jennifer Laidley. As Stuart mentioned, I'm a Maytree Fellow and have been the lead author and researcher on the report series since the 2019 report. And I'm here joining you from the beautiful unceded territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nation on the west coast of British Columbia, who for generations have cared for and stewarded these lands.
And today we'll be giving you a sneak peek of our upcoming annual Welfare in Canada report, which is coming out next week. And we'll give an overview, but we'll focus on Ontario specifically. What we're hoping you'll get out of this presentation is a familiarity with what is in the report so that you can potentially use the data and analysis yourself in your work, as well as a good understanding of the current state of welfare incomes in Ontario, as well as some ideas on how to improve the standard of living of social assistance recipients in Ontario and broader in the country. So here is the outline of our presentation today. We'll start by telling you about the report and its history, and then we'll take you through the different sections of the report, and specifically sharing the welfare income data for Ontario that and this is the new data for 2023. After that, we'll discuss how Ontario compares with the rest of the country. We'll discuss what other jurisdictions have been doing differently, and we'll leave you with some policy recommendations for both the provincial and the federal government.
So to start, what is Welfare in Canada? Not sure how many of you are familiar with it, but it's a very large report. It comes out annually. This year, I think it's about 250 pages. And it includes, as has been already said, analysis of total welfare incomes for various example household types in all 13 jurisdictions across Canada, as well as a look at some key features of social assistance programs across the country. But before we get into those details, I just wanted to let you know what's not in the report. Mohi's going to talk more about the methodology behind our calculations in just a bit, but I wanted to note that our calculations don't include special benefits or in-kind support. So anything where people would have to make special requests or applications are generally not included. And it doesn't include the numbers of people receiving social assistance in the jurisdictions, although, as been mentioned, we do have a sister report that Mohi authors called Social Assistance Summaries that provides that data, and I'd recommend that you have a look on the Maytree website for that. And the report, of course, doesn't apply to every household in every situation. It's not universal. Instead, it gives us a baseline look at the amount of income that our example household types would receive in direct financial benefits from the provincial or territorial and federal governments. And just as a bit of history, the report series really goes back nearly 40 years. In 1987, the National Council of Welfare, which was a body of the federal government, published a report called the Tangled Safety Net. It looked at social assistance programs across Canada and established a methodology for calculating total welfare incomes for 4 household types in all the provinces and territories, compared them to a low income threshold. At that time, they were using the low income cutoff, the LICO, And it examined asset and earned income exemptions, as well as a few other things. And this is where our 1986 data comes from. Then, starting in 1990, the Council began publishing annual reports on total welfare incomes for the previous calendar year, and this series was called Welfare Incomes. These reports were published annually until 2009. When the Council was disbanded by the federal government in 2012, the Caledon Institute of Social Policy realized that ending this data series would be a real loss, not only for governments, but also for researchers and for advocates. So they picked up the work in a new series that was called Welfare in Canada, starting with the 2012 calendar year and ending with 2016. We do have data for 2009 through 2011, although that data wasn't published in a report. And just so you know, Caledon was a private think tank dedicated to examining various social policy issues and was really quite influential in the public policy realm. Now, after Caledon wound down, Maytree picked up these reports, starting with the 2017 calendar year. So despite the fact that the federal government got out of the business of keeping track of total welfare incomes, Maytree continues this work. And as a result, we have nearly 40 years of data by which to evaluate Canada's progress on fulfilling its human rights commitments under the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, so that we can all see how well we're all doing on ensuring an adequate standard of living for households receiving social assistance.
So now that we've presented this report, what's in it? The report starts with an introduction and a methodology section, and those help provide some context. And next, we provide the results of our analysis and the calculations that we do through our modeling. And we usually start with an overview of welfare incomes across the country, and we follow this by separate sections for each province and territory, where we go into further detail. After looking at welfare incomes, we also break down some key features of social assistance and income supports across the country. And this includes asset and income exemptions, which benefits are indexed to inflation, and how benefits are structured. We also provide downloadable spreadsheets, and these are Excel files that contain all the data in the report, which you can use for your own analysis. We have spreadsheets for each jurisdiction and one that contains data across Canada. Over the next few slides, we'll take you through the different sections so that you can have an idea what they include and how you can use them. So the first thing we want to talk about was the methodology. And this section provides information on how we come up with these numbers, essentially. The details of the methodology that we use to calculate this data are at the beginning of the report, and I encourage you to read it, but I'll highlight some key elements to help better frame the data that we're going to discuss today. In each of the 13 provinces and territories, we look at the total incomes of 4 example households. And these are the unattached singles considered employable, unattached singles with a disability, single parents with 1 child, and couples with 2 children. And the children are aged 10 and 15. In total, we look at the incomes of 56 different households across the country. And you'll note that 4 times 13 is 52, not 56. So yes, we do have 4 extra households. And these extra households are because we include data for 2 disability programs in both Alberta and Manitoba, and 2 programs for the unattached single considered employable and the couple with 2 children households in Quebec. And this allows to have more clarity on what is going on in those jurisdictions. Something to keep in mind is that we make a number of assumptions when we do the calculations of the total welfare incomes. And just to mention a few, the heads of households are deemed employable, except for the unattached single with a disability. This distinction is not our own making, but it's very much still used in the way that governments speak of social assistance. The households had no employment income, and they did file their tax returns. The households are new recipients of social assistance and started to receive benefits on January 1st of the year in question. Also, income is for the calendar year and not the fiscal year. Our methodology allows us to make comparisons year after year, but as Jennifer said, it's important to note that the report doesn't reflect every person's experience of receiving social assistance. It's intended to be informative, but not universal. In terms of the process of how we go about, to create and calculate this data, we do the modeling ourselves, and we send our data to be reviewed by all 13 jurisdictions. We engage them throughout the process of producing this report, and we don't publish any numbers without their verification. So next, after the methodology, we have the overview section, which looks at welfare incomes across the country. We analyze provinces and territories separately because the realities of the North are very different and difficult to compare with the South or the rest of the country. In terms of what's included in this section, we start by comparing total welfare incomes by household type. Then we look at the percentage change of welfare incomes from the previous year. So, for this year, between 2022 and 2023, how did welfare incomes change? And we usually divide this into three categories. There's the nominal decrease, which means that the amount that they received was less than last year. Increases below inflation. So they did have an increase, but it did not make up for the cost for the impact of inflation. And then increases above inflation. This highlights which households are actually improving, which households are treading water, and which ones are seeing a worsening of their welfare incomes. After this, we provide a summary of all the changes in welfare incomes from the previous year. So if province X increased social assistance benefits by a certain amount of dollars, that information will be there. It is divided by type of support, which makes it easier to see what levers each jurisdiction is pulling to make changes to income supports. After that, we analyze the adequacy of welfare income, and we focus on the market basket measure, which is Canada's official poverty line. And we do this comparisons for all four household types and point out who is doing better or worse.
So now we'll take you, after the overview section, each jurisdiction has its own section, and those are listed alphabetically. And of course, we're going to present the data for Ontario, so we'll take you through the Ontario section. So this is a sneak peek of the new Ontario data. This is total welfare incomes for 2023, as has been mentioned. So every jurisdiction section starts with a breakdown of the components of welfare incomes and a table like you see on this slide. So when we calculate total welfare incomes, we look at 6 benefit buckets, which we call components. The first, of course, is basic social assistance. So that's just basic benefits. And the totals that you see here for the 4 households in Ontario are from the basic needs and shelter benefits received for all 12 months of the year. The second component is something that we call, and has been called for many years, additional social assistance benefits. And we include in that bucket those that are provided universally. So you can see in the table here that there aren't any in Ontario, although there are in other jurisdictions, and there were in Ontario years back. So things like the winter clothing allowance or the back to school allowance would have been included here, but those have been, as you know, rolled into basic benefits or into the child benefit. Things like a back to school allowance or a disability supplement, those kinds of things. The third and fourth components are federal child benefits and provincial child benefits. So that's the Canada Child Benefit and the Ontario Child Benefit in this instance. And the fifth and sixth components are federal and provincial tax credits and benefits. Of course, this applies to the territories too, so we would call those territorial benefits. The federal ones are the GST and HST credit and the credit supplement where that applies. And in the case of Ontario and 7 other provinces, the climate action incentive. And for Ontario, the provincial tax credits are, of course, the Ontario Trillium benefit. And for 2023, we included in these components where they apply, depending on how they were delivered, any one-time payments that were made to help with extra costs due to high inflation. In 2023, Ontario didn't provide any of those kinds of payments, although Alberta, BC, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and the Yukon did provide them. And the federal government provided the grocery rebate, which was delivered through the GST credit. These were cost of living payments. There were cost of living payments in 2022 that were also included in that report, and COVID-related payments in 2021 and 2020. So the first part of each province or territory section provides a table with all these data, as well as a narrative describing the specific benefit amounts that make up each of the components and any changes to payments that may have occurred since the previous year. Then we take a look at total welfare income over time. This next subsection provides these graphs, and we calculate these for all the example household types. So typically we have one graph for the unattached single households and a separate graph for the households with children. We calculate income over time based on constant dollar amounts. So these are constant 2023 dollar amounts, and that takes inflation into account. And we do this because inflation, of course, reduces purchasing power. So we want to provide as close a look at actual purchasing power over time as possible. The text, there's a lot of text in this section as well, and it describes the trend lines and makes comment on the reasons for particular peaks and valleys in the graph. So that's based on what was going on in those years, different policy decisions that were made.
And so the total welfare amounts do not say much without context, and because cost of living varies across the country and even within a certain province. So how do we measure how adequate total welfare incomes are? In the next subsection of each jurisdiction section, we compare total incomes for households in the provinces to the market basket measure, or MBM, which is Canada's official poverty line since 2018, and as well as to the deep income poverty threshold, which is 75% of the MBM, and we refer to it as the MBM DIP. For households in the territories, we compare total incomes to the northern market basket measure, which is similar. MBM thresholds are regional, so we use the thresholds for the largest city. In Ontario, we use the threshold for Toronto. However, other thresholds are available on the Statistics Canada website, and you can do the same analysis for other regions of Ontario. We also compare total welfare incomes in the provinces with two other measures, which are the low income measure and the low income cutoff. While we won't discuss those comparisons today, they are in the report for those who are interested. I'll also note that none of the measures account for the additional cost of living with a disability, so adequacy is likely underestimated for households that include a person with a disability. On this slide, you'll see the adequacy graphs we have for Ontario. In each graph, the black lines are for the MBM, the official poverty line, and the gray lines are for the deep income poverty threshold. In the first graph, we show how adequate incomes are for the unattached single households. And the second graph, the one with the blue bars, we compare the welfare incomes of households with children with the thresholds. And as you can see, all four households have incomes below the gray line. This means they are all living in deep poverty. They were all living in deep poverty in 2023. Of the four, the household that is furthest away from the deep poverty threshold is the unattached single considered employable. And this household's receiving Ontario Works. We end each jurisdiction section with an analysis of adequacy over time. We have a time series that go back to 2002 for provinces and 2018 for the territories. Like on the previous slide, the black line is the MBM, which is Canada's official poverty line, and the gray line is the deep income poverty threshold. On the side, we have the two graphs for Ontario, and as you can see, for all households, adequacy has been gradually declining over time. Also of note, all four households have been living below the gray line, which is deep poverty. Only the unattached single with a disability, which is the orange line, ever had a welfare income of above the deep income poverty line, and that was in the early 2000s. On that somber note, I'll just quickly mention that we end each jurisdiction section with a description and a link to the jurisdiction's downloadable spreadsheet, which includes all this data that you see right now.
So that's the total welfare income section of the report. We've got the overview, and then we've got the individual jurisdiction sections. And then we have a new section for 2023, which we called Key Features of Social Assistance. Now, we did have this data in, the data that's in this section was included in previous reports, but it had been included in appendices. And we felt this year that that didn't really give the data that it's due and didn't provide some necessary context for why it was there. So we decided to create this new section, which includes three parts, as Mohi mentioned earlier. First, we have a look at eligibility and how the needs test works based on asset and income tests. Then we have a look at which benefits and credits are indexed to inflation and which aren't, and that's for all of the jurisdictions. And then we look at the structure of basic benefits, and those, and that means those that are provided for basic cost of living expenses. So first, the eligibility section. Just to show you what this looks like in the Ontario case, we describe first in general terms how need is determined through the asset and income tests. And this is not specific to Ontario. This is kind of a general discussion of how the need test works in virtually every instance, in virtually every jurisdiction. Then we provide several data tables, the first of which is for liquid asset limits. And here's what that looks like for each of our household types in Ontario. And then we include associated footnotes where we need to. So there's a great long table with all of the jurisdictions and all of the liquid asset limits. Then we have data tables for income exemptions. And we look at exemptions for earned income and for unearned income separately. And actually, this is the first year that we've included data on unearned income exemptions. And you can see in this first table that we look at the base earned income exemption amounts. And then we have another column for additional exemption amounts above those. And then we have associated footnotes to explain anything that's that requires some more detail. And then in the second table, we look at unearned income, but we're very specific. As you know, there are lots of different kinds of unearned income that are exempt or not exempt. And we're very specific about the kinds of unearned income that we look at. And we look at employment insurance, CPP and CPPD, and workers' compensation programs. So the second table there shows whether there's an exemption for those sources of income. And of course, we add footnotes about the specifics for each jurisdiction. Then we have a section that looks at whether or not the benefits that our households receive are indexed to inflation. And of course, inflation indexing is critical to ensuring that benefit levels aren't eaten into by increasing costs of living. So you'll see in this example that we show which benefits are indexed, like those from ODSP, and which aren't, like those from OW. And we show which other payments are indexed. So all of the ones that we look at in the components of total welfare income section. And we track changes throughout the year, like we saw with ODSP benefits that were indexed in July of 2023. And the final part of, the key features section looks at, sorry about this table, it's not quite aligned. The final part of the key features section looks at the structure of basic social assistance benefits. Again, these are benefits for food and clothing and shelter and other basic costs. And to tell whether they're provided in separate payments or separate benefits, calculated and provided in separate benefits, or provided in a combined benefit. And we do this because it's helpful to see which jurisdictions provide them separately and which combine them, which allows for another way to judge adequacy, which is by comparing real costs in a jurisdiction to the amounts provided for these basic cost of living expenses. So that's the key features section.
Yeah, and that was our tour of the Welfare in Canada report and the different sections. So the question is, how does Ontario compare to other jurisdictions? We decided to focus on adequacy because, as you know, I mentioned earlier, total welfare incomes need a bit more context. And as you can see on this slide, Ontario has some of the least adequate welfare incomes among the provinces. Unattached singles considered employable have the ninth lowest adequacy of the 11 households that we have. Unattached single with a disability, so that's the single who receives ODSP is 8th out of 12. So relatively not as bad as the others, but not doing well either. Single parents with one child household is 9th out of 10. The couple with 2 children household is 10th out of 11. The only jurisdiction that have less adequate supports are New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And New Brunswick does index its supports, so it's likely that they may get ahead of Ontario unless changes are made to Ontario Works. I'll also mention that in the coming months, we'll release a policy brief that will provide more comparisons on the key takeaways from Welfare in Canada. In the next couple slides, we'll take you through some noteworthy changes that other jurisdictions have made in recent years.
Yeah, and so it's interesting to see what other provinces and territories are doing differently. We decided to just give you information about 4 what's going on in 4 other provinces. In Alberta, this last year, they decided to index all benefits and tax credits to inflation. And this is a change that came into force in 2023, and it was announced as part of that government's affordability action plan that was enacted to respond to high costs associated with high inflation. This is just a little screen grab there from their announcement in 2022. So that's an important difference. Alberta is indexing all their benefits. It's important to remember that all our example households in Alberta were still living in poverty in 2023, and 4 of the 5 were living in deep poverty. So while Alberta indexed benefits at the same time that Ontario did, Ontario chose only to index ODSP benefits, whereas Alberta chose to index much more. And then we'll give you a little look at Prince Edward Island. In Prince Edward Island, the government is making a multi-year series of investments in increasing basic social assistance rates. And here are a couple of graphs from the report that show the changes in total welfare incomes over time, which take inflation into account. And you can see that the increases since 2015 are really quite striking, especially compared to the graphs that we showed earlier for Ontario. And again, this was a response to increasing costs due to inflation, but just in the last couple of years, but the increases were higher than the rate of inflation. So households are actually ahead of the game. And these are permanent increases to rates, unlike in some other jurisdictions where the response to inflation was providing temporary supports. But again, it's important to remember that all households in PEI were still living in poverty in 2023. But the good news is that 3 of the 4 households we look at in PEI were living above the deep income poverty threshold. So they've made a lot of progress there. And this just demonstrates that governments can make positive change to total welfare incomes and therefore the quality of life of people receiving social assistance in their jurisdictions if they choose to do so.
So the next jurisdiction we wanted to look at was Manitoba, and there are 3 interesting points that we wanted to touch on. I'll try to go quickly because I know it's starting to get a bit long, and we want to leave time for questions. So the first one is that they've introduced a new social assistance program called the Manitoba Supports for Persons with Disabilities, which came into effect in January 2023. Until then, Manitoba did not have a separate disability-specific social assistance program like ODSP in Ontario. Instead, people with disabilities received a supplement under their Employment and Income Assistance Program, or EIA. The supplement, which is called Medical Barriers to Full Employment, is still in place. And the difference between the supplement and the new program is, I'd say, mainly the definition of disability. And Manitoba Supports has the stricter definition of the two. And so did this program make a big difference on the total welfare income of people with disabilities? I'd say somewhat. It's about 2,000 more per year, so it wasn't revolutionary necessarily, but it does make a difference. Importantly, unlike the older program, Manitoba Supports is indexed to inflation. So over time, the gap will likely grow between the two. The second point that I want to touch on is that in Manitoba, the equivalent of the shelter component of social assistance in Ontario is called Rent Assist. But unlike Ontario, it is not tied to social assistance, and all eligible low-income Manitobans have access to it. And the third point is that Manitoba Child Benefit, which is intended for low-income households, is not available to households receiving social assistance. And if they could access it, it would definitely make a significant improvement to their quality of life. And of the 5 households in Manitoba, all of them were living in deep poverty. Yeah, this child benefit could have made a difference for the households with children. The last jurisdiction we wanted to touch on was Quebec. In recent years, Quebec has introduced a number of interesting programs. The first was the Aim for Employment program, which was introduced in April 2018. With some exceptions, all new social assistance recipients have to go through this program for at least 1 year and up to 2 years before transitioning to the equivalent of Ontario Works. For persons with disabilities, they are exempt. The Aim for Employment program provides higher supports as well as services to train and or look for a job. As the name suggests, the goal is to support people to re-enter the labor market and to reduce the likelihood that they will be long-term social assistance recipients. Even though the program is relatively young, the government has regularly updated and added streams, and most notably in 2022, Aim for Employment recipients became eligible for the Manpower Training Measure, which provides between $370 and $475 per week to be part of a training program. Uh, and while maintaining in-kind services from social assistance. Another program that I want to briefly touch on is the new Basic Income Program, which was introduced in January 2023 after a few years as a pilot. I'd like to caution that while it is called basic income, it does not have the same characteristics as a UBI. The way the program works is that recipients of social solidarity, which is the equivalent of ODSP in Quebec, automatically switch to basic income if they were receiving benefits for 66 of the past 72 months. And it provides higher benefits and better income exemptions. Although Quebec has been trying out interesting new approaches to social assistance, the flip side is that they haven't been investing very much in the two older programs, which are social assistance and social solidarity, other than yearly indexation. Now that we've given you some highlights of the report, I'll just touch on some ideas to improve the quality of life of social assistance recipients very quickly. The overarching one is that we need higher income supports for everyone, and governments need to cooperate on that. Specifically also for unattached singles who tend to receive the worst supports. For households with children, child benefits at every level need to be enhanced. The Canada Child Benefit, Ontario Child Benefit are indexed, but we need more investments in the base amount.
And as a way to improve affordability without actually increasing incomes, governments could invest in better supports and services for all because, of course, when things like housing and other basic expenses come at a lower cost, people don't need as much income to purchase them. For Ontario, this is not any news to any of you, I'm sure. The policy recommendations are increasing social assistance-based benefits, indexing Ontario works to inflation, just as was done with ODSP, to avoid having them fall farther behind. And an important way to help increase total incomes is increasing earned income exemptions. And for those receiving income from employment insurance, CPP, and WSIB, exempting some or all of that income would be a big help.
As for the federal government, we have 6. I'll maybe skip through some of them. So first and foremost, we need the Canada Social Transfer to increase, to improve social assistance programs, ensure the money, sorry, actually goes to those programs. Second, over the last few years, the federal government has made one-time increases to GST, HST tax credit, and it would be good if they were permanent. Third, the Canada Workers Benefit is not accessible by most social assistance recipients, so enhancing it and creating a floor benefit would mean that the federal government would better support social assistance recipients. Then, we mentioned the market basket measure, which is right now the official poverty line, but the federal government can make investments to improve poverty measures by either creating MBM specific to persons with disabilities or seniors, or implementing Food Banks Canada new material deprivation index. Fifth is to further invest in the new Canada disability benefit so that the benefits are higher and it's more accessible to people. And lastly, the federal government needs to collaborate with all jurisdictions to ensure that the Canada disability benefit will not claw back social assistance. So far, only 4 jurisdictions have committed to no clawbacks, and this would not be difficult to implement. It just requires a change in regulations. And actually, today we released an advocacy toolkit that people can use to ask their governments to prevent CDB callbacks. We encourage you to use it and to share it with your network. So thank you for your time, and thank you again for OMSSA for organizing this webinar. If you're interested in reading the full Welfare in Canada report, we're aiming to release it next week. You can find it along with our other work like the CDB toolkit on Maytree's website, which is maytree.com. I also encourage you to sign up to our monthly newsletter and follow us on social media.
And as Moki said, I want to thank you all for attending the webinar today, and thanks to OMSSA, and we look forward to your questions and some discussion. Sorry, we've gone over time here. And I will stop sharing my screen.
No worries. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Mohi. Very informative and important information. Some of which our members would be, quite well aware of as administrators of the Ontario Works program, but also additional information, though, especially the comparative information that helps point out where Ontario stacks up against other jurisdictions across the country. So in the time we have left, we'll open up the floor to questions and get our Q&A started. Please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions. I'll do my best to direct them towards our presenters. At the same time, we'll open up our chat feature so you can make comments there as well. Maybe to get us started, and this may be taking it a step beyond what is included in the report, but based on your work in the area, what outcomes do you think we can expect if governments, especially the government in Ontario, continues to not invest significantly in improvements to income security? I don't know who wants to maybe take a stab at that.
I could start off anyway, if that's okay, Mohi. I mean, we've seen in those adequacy comparative graphs that folks, particularly unattached singles receiving on Ontario Works, but everybody in Ontario, all the households that we look at have been living in deep poverty for many, many years. And we all know what the effects of living in deep poverty are. I mean, from a very kind of instrumental perspective, it's really tough to get a job when you're living in deep poverty. It's tough to make ends meet. You end up kind of going from food bank to food bank and from one support to another support to try to make ends meet for yourself. So the expectation that folks who are living in those kinds of circumstances will be able to get well-paid employment that will lift them out of poverty is in some ways pretty unrealistic. So, and that's to say nothing of the impact on individuals. I mean, living in poverty has impacts on health. It has impacts on your mental health. It has impacts on your ability to parent. So, and this is to say nothing of the issue of income inequality. I mean, this is a problem that's been growing in Canada. I mean, this is outside the scope of the report, but this is a problem that's been growing in Canada for 40, 50 years. And income inequality is not good for anyone. It's not good for the people who are living in poverty, and it's also not good for the people who are not living in poverty. I mean, our communities need to be brought together more cohesively in order to function well. There's been lots of study on that issue as well. So, a lack of investment in improving incomes for the folks who are among the poorest of us is just going to exacerbate all those problems.
Yeah, I'll also quickly note that we're seeing on our in our cities and in our regions many more people show visible signs of poverty, like encampments or going to food banks. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's an entire population that is not as visibly, living inadequately at the moment. And as Jennifer mentioned, we're not putting people in the right circumstance to actually improve their lives, whether it's through work or if they can't work, to just live an adequate standard of living, and because it is something that everyone in society should have a right to.
Yes, thank you for that. You've touched on the impacts of living in deep poverty, and often the rationale put forward by the government for not making investments in certain parts of social assistance programs is that they're designed to be temporary in nature, and we know that the data in Ontario shows that people are relying and living on Ontario Works benefits for longer and longer periods of time, on average, approaching 3 years. So that's just not the case, and trying to make ends meet, as Jennifer pointed out, can become almost a full-time job as people try to run around to cobble resources together.
And can I just make one?
Yes,
sorry,
sure.
I just wanted to make one comment on that. And I think that's why, I mean, I don't want to speak for the government of Quebec, but I think that's why they've instituted the new Aim for Employment program, which provides significantly higher levels of income over that first year So it's as Moe was explaining earlier, it's a mandatory program in Quebec for new entrants to social assistance. And so, of course, there is there is that mandatory nature of the program. They must participate in particular kinds of training, but they receive significantly higher amounts of financial benefits as a result. And we think that the thinking behind that is to provide people with, when folks are first entering into the social assistance system, to provide them with a much more robust suite of services and financial benefits will help them to get back into the labor market, or help them get into the labor market if it's their first entry, rather than kind of consigning them to churning back off and on. I haven't seen the details of the analysis of whether or not that's working very well in Quebec. It's only, I think, the second year of the program, but it's worth thinking about and looking at.
Thank you for that. And we do have a few questions that have come in, so maybe I'll try to work through a couple of those. The first one touches on affordability for governments. So it says, does the report touch on or comment on the affordability for governments? Who pays for the increases that would need to be implemented? Who pays for the increases that would be needed to implement the policy recommendations that have been suggested? Is it a provincial? Would it be the province? Would it be the federal government? And the role of various levels of government on this important issue?
So I'll quickly mention that it's primarily the province and territories' responsibility to provide a baseline support for individuals. However, the federal government does and has provided top-ups to those programs. However, there's a big gap between households with children and households without children. For households without children, it's very, very low. The amount that they receive from the federal government, it's for most of them, I believe, under 10% of their welfare income comes from the federal government. For households with children, it's a lot of it is the Canada Child Benefit. So in terms of affordability, it depends on what we're aiming to do, right? Is it to improve social assistance? Then I would say it is, it will probably come from the province unless they make an agreement through the Canada Social Transfer for the federal government to contribute to that. Otherwise, for a lot of them, it does come from the federal government, like the new Canada Disability Benefit, which they've introduced, but that amount is very low. It's $200 a month. So they can definitely make significant improvements to that, and that cost would come from the federal purse.
Yeah, and I mean, just to get at the question of affordability for governments, I mean, no, that's not an issue that we deal with in the report. It is an issue that many economists have kind of looked at over time, and that is, where do governments get the money to do the things that they need to do? And I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but I mean, we've looked at we've lived through 40 or nearly 50 years now of fairly significant tax cuts, which really has limited the capacity of governments to do the things that they would otherwise have done, or that the populations that they're serving need to have done. I know that that's a difficult issue because, well, I mean, one of the difficulties of that issue is that once you reduce the fiscal capacity of government through tax cuts, it's pretty difficult politically to regain that ground, because taxes have become a political hot button. We know that there are in our federal politics, that issue is front and center for many of the parties that are involved there. But I mean, how else do we fund the things that we need to fund? This is what government is for. Government is a collection of people who contribute in various ways, most particularly through their taxes, and particularly through progressive taxation. So, decisions, and what I mean by that is where people who can't afford to pay more pay more. So, governments need to make decisions about what their priorities are in terms of how they raise income and in terms of how they distribute the services that people need in their jurisdictions.
You also mentioned that there's, some of the recommendations you mentioned suggested alternative ways to provide supports to people as policy options for government. And one of our questions that's come in asks about one of those. Does the study account for any way rent supplement benefits that might be available or provided to folks on social assistance, such as the Canada-Ontario Housing Benefit?
Yeah, no, we haven't included those. That's something that we've been looking at over the last couple of years as those agreements have been made between the federal government and the various jurisdictions. And we haven't included those particularly in the Ontario case because we have talked to the jurisdiction who have told us that either they don't know how many of their social assistance recipients are receiving that benefit, or they do know and it's not a majority. So the sort of special benefits or additional benefits that we've been including, we have a bit of a threshold for that. That's in our methodology that we look at a majority situation. So if the majority of benefit recipients are receiving a benefit, then we'll include it.
Okay,
it's
that
also
helps.
difficult. It raises an interesting point because the addition of additional benefits outside the social assistance program can really help, increase their incomes. But we have to be because of the methodology that we use, we have to be careful about which of them we include and which we don't.
I think one of the things that I really appreciated in hearing in the presentation was some of that comparative analysis and some of the look at options in other jurisdictions across the country. One of the questions we received asks how is Ontario's welfare incomes comparing over time to other jurisdictions? Are we getting worse or better? Is there a trend there?
I'd say it's definitely getting worse, and especially for OW recipients because it's been quite stagnant, for a while now. Whereas in most other jurisdictions, there have been increases to some extent. Also, Ontario hasn't been providing as many one-time supports as other jurisdictions. So even in the short term, other jurisdictions appear to be more adequate, even though people will lose those supports eventually. The change to ODSP, I think, was a positive one because it increased ODSP for the first time in a number of years, and indexing it, I think, will help maintain a certain level, whereas most jurisdictions don't index their benefits yet. So relative to them, I guess Ontario will do better on ODSP, but OW is gonna just keeps worsening and worsening, and it's on track to being one of the least adequate programs in the country.
Yes, and I think though, if you see the comment in our chat, it kind of reflects on the history of rates in Ontario, where there was a comment that we were just getting back to the level that was provided to people in the mid 90s only
Yes.
recently. But there's a question at the end of that comment that I think is really important for us to think about as municipalities, because on the front lines we do see the struggles that our individuals that we're serving have in meeting their basic needs and being able to be successfully exit social assistance. How do we connect the dots, or do you have any thoughts on how we can connect the dots from our position so that other government, levels of government, the province and the federal government, see the cost of poverty and listen to some of the advocacy points that we do try to advance through OMSSA and other channels?
I mean, you tell me. I've been trying to crack that nut for a while of how do you convince governments to increase social assistance, and I don't think it has necessarily to do with the partisanship or anything, because across the country the governments who make or don't make improvements it's not necessarily based on that. It's just a willingness from the government to make improvements. Um, I mean, I guess a more pragmatic point is that if you can't improve amounts, maybe try to improve other aspects of it, like changing exemptions. So having a partial unearned income exemption, or increasing the employment income base exemption so that people can keep more of their money as as they work more, having better services. So I mean, the income is a really big problem, but if it's impossible to be heard, which it's not to say that it is impossible, just I think we have not been successful in recent years to convince governments to improve Ontario Works. Um, but yeah, there are other aspects maybe that we can push.
Yeah, and as someone who did advocacy on social assistance in Ontario for 12 years, I can tell you that this is a very difficult issue. I think that I think that I think that one of the keys to this issue is the fact that so much of is the fact that there is so much stigma associated with receiving social assistance. There is so much societal judgment that is accrued to people who are receiving welfare supports, despite the fact that these are our neighbors, these are our friends, these are our family members in many instances. So I think that anything that we can do to reduce stigma around people who are needing support from government programs will go a long way to creating the kind of, I think that oftentimes governments make decisions on support programs based on who's worthy and who's not, to say it bluntly. So, unless we get to a position where we realize that, that all of us have a right to an adequate standard of living, no matter our circumstances, no matter who we are in society, I think it'll be difficult to make progress. So the more we can do to reduce that kind of stigma and to talk about human rights, to talk about the rights of people to an adequate standard of living, I think makes a big difference.
Yes, and I think I see a comment in the chat that and one of our questions that sort of says, what is the cost, of folks remaining in deep poverty, especially across other systems of support beyond social assistance that often fall to municipalities to address. And I think homelessness was referenced by Mohi as something that we're seeing more, like increase and be more entrenched in our communities. You know, do you touch on any programs the government would need to implement and the cost of providing those supports beyond social assistance in your work? And are there connections between, that you're aware of that study sort of the cost of poverty and the impacts on other systems in terms of driving costs there?
Yeah, no, we don't do that in the report. Mohi can speak about other, can speak better than I can about other work that Maytree is doing. I know that there was a study back in, gosh, I guess it was 2007, something like that looked at the cost of poverty. And these costs, I mean, it's an interesting question, and it becomes a question of politics about who's responsible and which levels of government, because of the system that we have, which levels of government need to take responsibility for these things. I don't know how much governments look at, or sorry, I shouldn't say governments, rather I should say kind of the political side of governments look at costs over the longer term. I think that that's a tough nut to crack. And they don't necessarily look at the costs that are accruing to other levels of government. Maybe I'll just throw that over to Mohi because I could go on about this issue.
Yeah, Mohi, do you have a last thought on that question?
Yeah, last thought. So, for sure, I think costing policy recommendations is always a good idea because it gives government, an idea of how much uh, this would impact their budgets. We have a report that we released a year and a half ago, I believe, called to enhance the Canada Workers Benefit and make it accessible to social assistance recipients. and that's called the Canada Working Age Supplement. And I encourage you all to read it because it is something that we want the federal government to implement, but the government of Ontario could also implement it because other jurisdictions have done something similar.
Well, thanks for that, Mohi. And we're approaching 2 o'clock, so we will need to wrap things up on this webinar. Jennifer and Mohi, thank you so much again for being with us today. Thank you for sharing your insights and your expertise with us as part of this conversation and giving us a sneak peek on the report that's coming up. I think a couple of takeaways for us, for me, is that in our sector, if we're wanting to advance change and make improvements, we need to know our data. We need to be able to tell our story. Your last point about Jennifer, about costing out options and providing some options to policymakers so that they can see what's happening in other areas or what the opportunities are that may make a difference, are all important for us to prioritize and to make sure that we've done our homework and we're providing the best advice we can. So, as a reminder, the Welfare in Canada report should be available by the end of July, and OMSSA will make this recording available after the report has been published to all of our participants. Everyone will receive a survey shortly to provide feedback on today's webinar. Please take a few minutes to share your thoughts with us, as your feedback does help us inform the development of future webinars. And I want to just thank everyone for your interest and thank our special guests today for joining us, and wish everyone a great day. Thanks. Goodbye.
Thank you.